Hey everyone, today I am talking to someone I am very excited to be interviewing today. It's Jordy Rosenberg, author of Confessions of the Fox, which, if you've seen my video on it, I really enjoyed. So I'm extremely excited to be talking to you. How are you, Jordy?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed your video too, so thanks for doing that. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing as well as can be,
Yeah.
state of the world at the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you're a professor of 18th century literature, gender and sexuality studies, and critical theory. That's a hell of a resume. University of Massachusetts Amherst. Tell me about you and your background. Introduce us to who Jordy Rosenberg is.
Oh no. Uh, yeah, no, there's not too much to say about me. I feel like that description sums up a lot of it. I originally was trained as an 18th century studies scholar, and then with sort of a side interest in sort of contemporary critical theory or 20th century critical theory, sort of the heritage of the Marxist Frankfurt School theorists, like Theodore Adorno, Walter Benjamin, that kind of thing. And I was hired to teach, in a scholarly capacity. And then after I published like a really dull academic book, I decided that I would pursue my sort of secretly held fantasy of translating some of my interest in the 18th century and in Marxism into a novel.
If I recall, there's a publication of yours. Was this the dull novel that you were sort of self-deprecatingly referred to, the Daddy Dialectic?
Yeah, no, that's just an essay. That may be dull as well, but no, I published it's a scholarly book that came out from Oxford University Press in like 2011, and it's on religious enthusiasts in 18th century Britain. And yeah, it was really. I, I think maybe the conclusions of this book were not wrong, but I can't really recommend it as a fun read. Toward the end of that book, I sort of became obsessed. There's a chapter, a very incongruous chapter that has nothing to do really with the rest of the book. An incongruous chapter on poetry and infrastructural architecture in London in the period, in particular the way the sewers were constructed. And I became really obsessed with waste management in the 18th century. And for reasons that are kind of maybe too long to talk through here, that sort of led me to some of the primary text research that ended up becoming the source for the novel. But I really, 18th century Britain had like remarkably unsophisticated sewer architecture. It was you would have to think like almost deliberately bad. Like the Romans centuries earlier had much better sewer architecture, but the British architecture of sewers was just absolutely, I don't know, grade school level. Um, and this kind of just really interested me for reasons that I might or might not get into.
So the novel in question, Confessions of the Fox, I no, it's no secret that I absolutely loved it. It rapidly turned into one of my favorite novels. I just want to sort of ask about like what the inception of this novel is. So you're talking about how your interest in 18th century waste management led to some of the scholarly research that was sort of the basis of this novel. So can you tell me like the central idea, the premise, which is Jack Shepherd, this old like almost folk legend of old London, the thief, the burglar, the jailbreaker, sort of it's his story but told sort of in a semi speculative way where he was a trans man, and then that was just a detail that was lost to history, is what I would describe as the premise of the novel. So how did you come up with this? Like talk to me about like how the sort of the central like story component of this novel formed as you were coming up with it.
There were a couple of intersecting interests. One was just in the archive of primary source documents about Jack Sheppard himself. He was a remarkably kind of notorious figure in the 18th century, and it was sort of legendarily said that more ordinary people in the early 18th century knew the name of Jack Sheppard than knew the name of the Queen. Like he was a really huge figure, and he was someone who had been in a sort of bound apprenticeship to a carpenter. He had been kind of essentially like given away or sold by his mother at a very young age. He apprenticed as a carpenter, and he learned really all the kind of interior workings of materials worked, and had kind of an insider knowledge then of locks and window frames. And he eventually kind of broke out of his apprenticeship and became really kind of just a petty thief. He wasn't mostly known for his thievery. What he was known for was that he was arrested multiple times and jailed in a bunch of London prisons, including the most notorious Newgate, and broke out in these kind of spectacular jailbreaks. And the way in which he kind of understood how to put together architecture and building materials was part of how he understood how to get out, and also part of how he understood how to kind of break into things. And his jailbreaks became these like notorious things that were covered like in 18th century sort of proto newspaper materials and broadsides. And he was known for being in a kind of very infamous rivalry with Jonathan Wild, who ran this very kind of prominent thief catching operation, but also was, kind of typically enough running both sides of the law. And Wild would kind of run these gangs who would steal stuff, and then he would run these thief catching operations where private citizens would come to him and say, give him money to find their stolen property. And of course he knew where the property was, because he had in fact kind of run the gang to steal it. So he was working both sides of the law in a very kind of typically corrupt police kind of way. And Sheppard kind of very famously refused to join Wild's gang. And so Wild really had it in for him, and their kind of cat and mouse game really became the stuff of legend. And eventually Wild did capture him, and Sheppard was hung at the age of I think it was in 1724, so I think he was 21. And then later Wild was himself caught for doing these double dealings, and he was hung as well. And his body, if I'm not mistaken, is still on display. There was a kind of famous practice of dissecting executed prisoners after their deaths. He was dissected and displayed his skeleton in one of the Royal Society of Surgeons kind of museums in London. I think it's possibly still there, but I've never seen his body. So that's a long way of saying that Sheppard's story in itself really fascinated me, because it represented the investment of ordinary people in a kind of resistance to the birth of commercial culture and early capitalism, because Sheppard was kind of this figure who was able to just flout the rules. He was able to take things. He was able to break out of these carceral institutions. He's been the subject of a number of famous kind of retellings. John Gay's Beggar's Opera, which came out shortly after Sheppard was executed, then became like the most well-attended opera ever in London to that point. And Brecht's Threepenny Opera in 1924, I think it came out. So I felt like it was time for a a rewriting of the rewritings, sort of drawing from Gay and Brecht, but really more so from some of the ephemera about Shepard that I felt like kind of got lost in Gay and Brecht. Just the level of libidinal investment that ordinary people had in Shepard, how much they loved him, and also the way they eroticized him. And this kind of goes to your point about transness. People would kind of write in early versions of like letters to the editor, reports on Shepard's whereabouts, rumors. Even after he had been executed, he would be rumored to be either like haunting London or have been spied, but it was always, he often was described as kind of gender nonconforming, in the sense that he was described as kind of very assigned male at birth, but very effeminate, very small, very live, and that was part of how he was rumored to be able to get out of spaces, almost kind of supernaturally move through walls and small spaces. But it was also part of his appeal. And so that kind of fell out of the major retellings of his life. And so I just kind of ran with it.
So it was kind of like a in terms of coming up with like fantastical, not fantastical, but like, you know, elements of the story that you can sort of bend towards the fiction, making him a trans man is sort of an extension of how people reported him to be, you know, a rather like lithe, effeminate sort of man.
Yeah, I wasn't really interested in the, whether or not he was. To me, it's kind of an absurd question. Was he or was he not really trans? It's first of all anachronistic, but second of all, to me, beside the point. What I was interested in was this intersection of kind of gender nonconformity or gender play, even, and the birth of the sort of modern prison system and resistance to it, and the birth of Western capitalism. That's what I was sort of interested in, kind of intensifying those connections through character and plot and fiction. But really, what I was interested in was just kind of an intensification of this nexus, and how to kind of get at that aesthetically.
Yeah, that was an element of the novel that started to fascinate me as I was reading into the surrounding fiction, because I had never heard of Jack Shepherd or any of the surrounding information before I had read your novel. And as I was reading it, I decided to, you know, go on Google and look up where certain inspirations for the story came from. And it kind of, I kind of, as I was reading into like how like Jonathan Wild is considered to be one of the people who laid the groundwork for what would be considered the modern policing system in London, and how the specific era the book is set in is sort of seen as like the primordial days of capitalism forming in the European world. And it just sort of like clicked into place that like, yeah, actually making Jack Shepherd, you know, LGBT in some way seems to just make a lot of sense thematically for a story like this, because like LGBT people have always kind of been like, you know, as a whole have kind of been this anachronistic kind of like, we've never fit in with the colonial capitalist worlds whatsoever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was.
Not that we'd want to, but you know, you get my point.
Yeah, no, I think I was. They're also trying to kind of play with certain historical anachronisms. There were just elements of the fictionalization of this story that were inspired as much by the history of the 18th century as by the present. You know, how much abolitionist organizing and anti-prison, anti-carceral organizing is also queer organizing. And it was just kind of like a way for me to kind of explore through a set of sort of just like fictional hypotheses, the kind of intensity of this connection. And it really kind of came out to just how many sort of comrades I knew who were queer and doing abolitionist organizing, and kind of wanting to do kind of a long view. around that.
Speaking of characters being reimagined, Bess, as I understood Bess, she's not described as. I don't think she is described as non-white in other retellings of the of the Jack Shepherd story. So, can you tell me about the decision to make to sort of change Bess's identity in this way to make her of a mixed race background?
Well, there are a couple of things with Bess. One is that there's like almost no archival material at all that I was able to find, on this historical person at all. There was someone who was said to be Jack's kind of partner in crime and lover, who was also said to be a sex worker, who was known as Edgeworth Bess. Sort of legendarily, he one of Jack's jailbreaks that was kind of like frequently, sort of.
Oh yeah, this is the one that was illustrated, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was illustrated. Was him breaking her out of jail. So I found that very romantic, of course. But there's very little known about her, and her character changes so much in the retellings, also in Gay and in Brecht. And I have to say, in Gay and in Brecht, the way the female characters are represented, both Bess and who becomes more famous is the character of Jenny Diver in Brecht, are kind of misogynist renderings. Like there was a lot of kind of misogynist renderings of the character in general, both in Gay in the period, and then in these kind of anonymous hack biographies that came out about Shepherd. And it was kind of frequently kind of suggested that Bess had kind of lured the innocent, hapless Jack into a life of crime and basically ruined him and sowed his demise. So I wanted to have a different characterization of this character than that. But the other thing was that just this is a pretty obvious point, but any 18th century scholar of Britain knows that the city was far from as white as most historical fiction and television and movies would have it. And so, since we know very little about this character, and since all we really have are these misogynist renderings of her, I figured I could take as many liberties as possible. But it also seemed to me entirely within the bounds of reasonable imagination that this character did not necessarily have to be white. It's a character we know nothing about, almost. And so I think I was sort of trying to get at the extent to which scholars like Gretchen Gerzina and David Olusoga have really demonstrated the extent to which Britain was like a very Black and South Asian and Southeast Asian city in this time, but that's not really the story that we get told. So I thought that was important to kind of reimagine. Part of the character of Bess was an attempt to kind of resist or flout the convention around the representation of her character as a femme fatale. And then something I was very frustrated with my own editing process had to do with the character of Ursula, who's Voth's kind of love interest in the present interview. But there was a much longer version of Voth's story that got cut out, which eventually ended up with him teaming up with Ursula against the corporation. And it turns out she's not a femme fatale at all. She's not kind of doing him in. He's mistaken about this. But that whole section got cut out in the editing process. And so it sort of ends up with Ursula fulfilling a kind of femme fatale function that I kind of never intended her to have. So that's been one of my main regrets, is that I didn't figure out how to kind of efficiently work back in her the sort of twist where she turns out not to have been kind of screwing him over.
I never like really considered Ursula's character in much depth, but now that you've said that, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. Well, I'm almost disappointed that it got cut too.
Yeah, she was a casualty of the editing process. There were like, I don't even know, like maybe 100 extra pages where she and Voth go on like they sort of team up and they sort of take on the corporation. But then I think that the editing process was like, this is way too much. The other thing about Bess was that, and this is a complete and total fabrication on my part, is that I really wanted her to be a character through which we could learn a little bit about the history of the fens and the draining of the fens in the 17th century.
So that's a series of wetlands across the east coast, the southeast coast of England, I believe.
Yeah. And the draining of the fens, I think actually Bess's sections were the sections that I wrote first in the book, even before Jack, because I was just so kind of taken with learning about this history of essentially the peasantry that were living a semi-amphibious lifestyle in these wetlands. It said that they had learned how to walk on stilts. They knew all kinds of kind of hunting techniques that you could, use in landscape like this. Their houses were built partially on stilts. The fens became a huge target for these early capital projects and major kind of geoengineering projects, really. And they imported the British. There was like a corporation of surveyors that they had heading up this project, and they imported like Dutch capitalists because Dutch capitalism was so much more advanced than British capitalism at this time, and the Dutch knew about lowlands, of course, and they imported these Dutch surveyors to come and help them drain the fens and basically just starve people out of their subsistence living and alter the landscape, at a grand scale. And I became really, really interested in learning about the kind of struggles that went on against the surveyors. And so there's a lot that Bess as a character kind of allowed me to tap into with the kind of historical representation of this group called the Fen Tigers, who would do these grand like sabotagings of the drainage projects. Needless to say, I should also say that, as usual, the capitalists and the surveyors were so hapless and really understood so little about the land that they didn't even at times need to be sabotaged because their own drainage plans were so poorly executed. So they would drain the land. Their idea was, we're going to drain these swamps and then we'll turn them into kind of essentially enclosed private property to pasture animals on. It's such a much less efficient use of land than having it as either wild land or even agricultural land to plant on. But they would drain it when they finally managed to actually figure out how to drain the land. The land then would dry out and sink, and then the water would flood back in. And so the drainage project took at least a century, I believe, to actually complete it or partially complete it. So anyway, that's maybe neither here nor there, but just foibles of these people.
Just capitalists doing as they do.
Yeah.
Failing.
Yes,
Yeah.
failing but screwing everything up in the process.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to use an example of like colonialism from inside England at the time, because something that I think a lot of people who live in first world capitalist countries are kind of blissfully aware of, or at least, I would say a lot of probably more white people are blissfully ignorant of this, than others, is eventually like colonialism and capitalism, because it's ever expanding, will eventually turn on its own people. And we're seeing a lot of that today, where the methods of colonialism are starting to be brought inside the borders of capitalist countries and are being used against its own population now.
Yeah, I was again, as a historian, sort of a literary historian of the period, you can't really fail to kind of end up learning a fair amount about the British treatment of Ireland and Scotland, but also yes, I think extending some of that logic to the Fenlands, a colonial logic, and using kind of colonial techniques is kind of exactly what I was sort of interested in exploring a little bit. The very like the famous scholar Cedric Robinson, in his very well-known book Black Marxism, makes the point that the British and Europeans kind of taught themselves racism on their own people, even before they inflicted it upon peoples of the global South and the Americas. So that there's almost like an indigenous form of British racism that gets sort of played out within Britain and the continent. So and lots of people have written around sort of work on British internal colonies. So I think it's completely possible, if not necessary, to kind of make that argument and do that sort of long historical research on how that played out.
Another thing that I just keep wanting to talk about various elements of this book's like premise, but the Sentinels. So I learned that through reading this book and then looking elsewhere that Jonathan Wild is considered one of the people who laid the foundation for what eventually became our modern police force, or at least the police force in London, and then that got exported to. That model got exported to other places in the world. So and at that point, I was like, oh, it makes total sense that for this type of story you would make Jack Shepherd LGBT in some way, because the relationship between the LGBT community and the police is long and very unfriendly, to put it mildly. So can you talk to me about like who the Sentinels were? And how you use them in your novel.
Okay, so there were a couple different things that I was interested in there. I think that just wanting to jostle people around this denaturalization of the police, because if you don't know that, Britain didn't really have a municipal police force until the late 18th century, you would just assume, well, yeah, sure, like, there's a way in which policing has so authorized itself that you'd think, well, if you have a society, well, you have to have police. And that's not even historically true. It's not even historically close to true. In fact, police are within, the West, actually a relatively recent phenomenon. So I was sort of interested in writing a book that was kind of predates the formation of sort of an official police force. Jonathan Wild was considered kind of this forerunner, this entrepreneur of policing. And, funnily enough, or not so funnily enough, the author Henry Fielding, the famous, kind of like that, there's that famous triumvirate of Richardson, Defoe, and Fielding, and it's like the three major early 18th century British authors. Fielding was obsessed with Jonathan Wild. He wrote sort of very fantastical pseudo biography of Jonathan Wild. And then Fielding, in addition to being like a quite famous author, became a magistrate, and he formed the Bow Street Runners, who then really are considered to be the kind of like transition point into policing. The Bow Street Runners were the first group that was paid with public funding to police, Britain's own citizens. So there's actually this weird through line. You've got Jonathan Wild, Fielding writing the biography of Wild, and then Fielding kind of coming up with this kind of the actual prototype for the police. But prior to that, private citizens would pay their own funds, essentially, to these thief-catching operations, such as Wild's, in order to recover lost property.
So they were kind of a police force for hire, almost.
Right. And so there was that, but then you also have the sort of authorization of forms of municipal policing through either at frontier spaces, like border spaces, like the docks. There were private kind of dock policing operations in this period, and also the authorization of, you have to see the police as a kind of military deployment against the people around either plague or threats of plague. And so you have, during the sort of 17th century plague outbreak, the sort of panic around, there was a panic. Let me backtrack. As we know, there was a major outbreak of plague in Britain in the 17th century. And then plague recurred in 1721, I believe, in Marseille, which was like a major trading port of London. So there was a lot of anxiety that plague was coming back. And when they got the sort of plague hints, as one might expect, and as we're kind of seeing resonances with now, the government takes the opportunity of the fear of plague to kind of put into place a bunch of really kind of authoritarian legislations. So one had to do with authorizing cordons sanitaires and the establishment of cordons sanitaires, like policed boundaries around neighborhoods and areas, policing forms of movement, and so you had things like plague sentinels who were authorized to use force against people who were moving around the city or even leaving their houses. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, not until the Bow Street Runners do you have what's essentially like a standing, publicly funded entity to police the people. But before then, you do have publicly funded entities that will perform policing operations, but under cover of something like emergency.
I do think when I was talking to Redfern John Barrett, he introduced me to a term that I quite liked. It wasn't him who came up with this, but he said the Flintstonization of history is like when we take what's considered normal to us in the modern world and we kind of transpose it back in time. And he was talking about like family units and romantic relationships, and how it's very easy. The reason why the Flintstones is the point of reference there is, like, you take the nuclear family, one man, one woman, and kids, white picket fences. They all have like one family unit per household, and they've transposed that onto the Stone Age, where it's like, obviously people didn't live like that in the Stone Age, but it's kind of like the same. Do you think that we think about police sort of in the same way? Like, even if there's no formalized like organization called the police, like if we're thinking about, for example, like ancient Rome, we might just assume that, say, like Roman guards or Roman like centurions or whoever might step into the role of what we would consider a formalized police force.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I obviously, this is all kind of like a weird conversation to be having now, because I think at a mass scale at this moment, the conversation around abolition has taken such a leap forward that I think it is very possible for many more people now suddenly to understand the police as a historical contingency, something that has not always existed and something that does not always need to exist. But even at the time that I was writing this book, which was, I don't know, however many years ago, it came out 2 years ago, but it's the product of like 10 years of labor before that. It was a little bit more of a kind of less of a mainstream conversation. In a way, I don't know. Now it seems like we're all suddenly able to imagine, the abolishment of the police, and the fact that, this institution is just a historical contingency that has managed to naturalize itself as if it's part of the natural order itself, when it's not. Yeah.
There's only slightly off topic, but in Australia, we're not. It's harder to have a discussion about abolishing the police in Australia, just because in my country, the relationship between the police and what I suppose you could call the general public is a lot better than it currently is in America. Like, we have a lot more regulations for our police force than in America, where it seems like that. Well, I mean, they literally do get away with murder in America. I've noticed that when I've been talking to people in Australia about what's happening in the United States, that a lot more people who are even left wing, who I know, very defensive of the Australian police force in particular. Even though our police force does have a better relationship with the general public, they have a very, very poor record when it comes to our Aboriginal population. In fact, I attended a Black Lives Matter rally in Melbourne, and at that time, the number of Aboriginal deaths in custody since a commission was set up to keep track of them was 432, and the commission was only set up in like the 1990s. So before that, there could have been countless more. The conversation surrounding police abolition has certainly like moved forward in America, although frustratingly, it's not moved forward as much in Australia. Although yeah, I do recognize that the reason why it's moved forward a lot in America is because the police are because the police are like, you know, so much worse. And it's not to say that the police are, you know, by extension good in Australia. They're just not as bad as in America at the current point in time, I should say.
Yeah, I went. I was at the Sydney Writers Festival last year. I had a great visit with a couple of radio presenters from 3CR Community Radio. I think it's out of Melbourne, who were also at the festival, and they were like all community abolitionists and stuff. But I think we had some sort of similar conversations about sort of the you know, where the level of conversation was in the U.S. versus Australia. But I did get the sense that there was a fair amount of kind of abolitionist organizing going on in Australia. Just yeah, it might not be on the same level as what's happening right now here. But this is just a plug for 3CR Community Radio out of Melbourne, because these guys were awesome.
Getting back to the novel, I wanted to ask you about Dr. Voth, because this character is amazing, and I kind of like feel that we need to talk about him before we talk about like the book's kind of like style of storytelling and narration. I refer to him as Dr. Voth in my video because I went back and I did like a skim read of some of the footnotes in the novel, searching for a first name. Does he have a first name?
No, he doesn't have a first name. I never gave him a first name. Yeah.
Tell me about Dr. Voth, because I had one person who was reading the novel who interpreted him as a stand-in for you, because he's also a trans man who's a professor at a university. So like, what is the inspiration behind Dr. Voth? Tell me about him.
Voth really didn't have as prominent a role in kind of one of the initial drafts that I was working with. There was someone who was editing this found manuscript of Jack Shepherd, but you don't really get, in this earlier version, you didn't really get much of a sense of who he was. But at a certain point, it was after I'd sold the book, but I was editing it, and at that point I knew the book was going to be published by Random House, and so I realized that a lot of anxiety had kind of crept into my editing process around the fact that the book was going to have a mainstream publisher, and I noticed that I was getting very anxious about making sure that like Jack, who was the kind of main trans character, that he was kind of a very upstanding person, and I was really getting very anxious about how this character was going to be read, and you know, at every moment kind of representing transness well or not, and it was really like fucking with my writing process, I guess. And I just kind of snapped, and I just thought, you know, there needs to be like a slightly more conflicted voice, or a voice that is a more of kind of like a real character. I think I sort of just started to feel like I needed a character, like a trans character, who could fuck up. And so at that point, then I just started kind of feeding in more of the editor character, Voth's kind of own perspective. And I was very concerned that this really wouldn't fly with my editors at Random House. But then when they read the Voth sections, they were very kind of into it, and they were just very encouraging, and they were kind of like, just go with it. This character is completely unhinged. And they seemed to think that was, okay. I think it felt important to me to have a character who was just allowed to be a little bit more real, and fallible, and a schmuck, essentially. Is he, a stand-in for the author? I well, first of all, I hope not. On a certain level, he's very like screwed, but I think there is some kind of like a metafictional comment in there around, the almost mainstream demand around transgender memoir. Famously, the trans thinker Vivian Namaste said, some time ago, that memoir or autobiography at that time, I think autobiography was the term more in vogue, is the only genre in which trans people will be allowed to write. There can be like a very spectacularizing thirst for us to kind of like constantly confess ourselves in public, and so I think Voth was on a certain level like a kind of metafictional squawk of frustration around some of that.
It's interesting that you talk about that, because I ran into this question so many times when I was reading into LGBT fiction. The reason why I ran across your novel is because I started a project for myself where I would just read a whole bunch of LGBT fiction and then recommend what I thought were the best ones. But of course, there's no such thing as, determining what is good or not good without some sort of a framework. And so I was always wrestling with the question, like, what would I consider to be a good example of like trans literature or non-binary literature or something like that? Because at the end of the day, I have to make a judgment based on something. I can't simply, pluck out of the ether the objective definition for what makes a good trans character or a good non-binary character or anything like that. There is always, the question of how is the audience, how is my audience, who I'm recommending these novels, going to interpret the characters that they read in these novels? Like, and it was even a question that I wrestled with too, is like, do I recommend only books that have what would be considered like, morally upstanding versions of LGBT characters, or do I recommend them something that's a little bit more raw, a little bit more dirty, a little bit more honest? And it's a challenge when you're when you're thinking about a non-LGBT audience, and also just like, it's also kind of relative. Like, it's a question that I was thinking about, like, myself as a non-transgender person, like, is my judgment on, a trans character even valuable in the first place? And so I could not that I say that I completely understand what your anxiety was, but I can see where that sort of thing comes from, because it is sort of an eternal question of like, do you represent LGBT characters in this sort of like way that can't, in this sort of like idealistic way, to make them more like palatable or better represented to cis straight culture? Or do you represent them honestly, warts and all? And what you might gain for the honest representation is, you might lose in terms of how is the audience going to then see these characters, because it is a bit of a challenge, because people tend to like, view every person as representing their entire culture. Like, every trans person has to represent all trans people, every gay person has to represent all gay people, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of frustrating. Is that kind of like where the root of your anxiety and around Dr. Voth came from?
I mean, I think the wanting to just be allowed to write character in and of itself was but I do think that the landscape is shifting. There's so many recent books and forthcoming books, trans books, that I think are doing so much of this kind of experimentation with character. The Australian author Vincent Silk book, Sisters of No Mercy, if you haven't read that, is really great and kind of just totally, I think at some point I saw it described as hysterical realism. Like it's really, really at such an accelerated pace and so irreverent and great. I mean, I could name like a million different books. There's going to be a book that comes out in a couple of months, Tori Peters in the States and the UK too. Her novel, Detransition Baby, also is going to kind of like push back against certain kind of mainstream truisms about trans representation and trans characters. And it will kind of, I don't want to give too much away about this novel, but it sort of tracks, a couple of trans characters, many of whom are kind of like extremely conflicted, ambivalent characters. There's just a lot of books that I think are now starting to kind of appear that maybe aren't as hung up. I think in a way I was just more hung up than other people. I think I just really I don't know, I have like a very strong and sort of self-defeating superego that was so stressed out about the mainstream release of this book that like I think it on a certain level really did hamper Jack's character. I'm not very happy with Jack's character, to be honest. But then I sort of tried to kind of correct for that with Voth on a certain level, or that's my sort of self-analysis around that. The other problem, of course, with writing a kind of pseudo 18th century novel is that they didn't have characters in the early 18th century to the extent that we understand character now. Like they didn't really have, this is like a pre-Freudian moment. They didn't represent interiority or depth or character depth in the same way that we understand it. There's the kind of Freudian understanding of the novel and sort of like this understanding that, once you have an idea, a concept of like interior psychology, then you can have sort of a history of interiority or a literature of interiority. But it also is the case that I think it's been very influentially argued, to my mind, that really the birth of the modern prison system is tied inextricably to the development of novelistic character. So John Bender, in a kind of famous within 18th century studies analysis, he has a book called Imagining the Penitentiary, and he basically argues there that you really don't get a sense of character. And this is not the Freudian argument. This really is a Foucauldian argument. It's a social history argument saying, you don't get a sense of sort of interior character until you get the modern prison system, because the modern prison system is the kind of institution in which the idea of character development is born, because the idea is, right, that you spend a certain amount of time in prison, your quote unquote sentence, and the idea is that your character will be reformed, right? And so that sort of, for Bender, sets the kind of model of the novel. The novel, in a sense, is a kind of large prison cell in which we watch a character be reformed or developed. But then there too, that you don't quite have that, or you really only have the birth of that in the sort of early 18th century. In any case, I'm giving kind of two different views on why early 18th century literature doesn't have a developed sense of character, or doesn't have a sense of character development. One is that it's pre-Freudian, and the other is that it's kind of before the massive explosion of the idea of the prison sentence as the kind of framework for within which character develops. But the main point is, if you want to write a novel where you're mimicking 18th century conventions, as I did, it's going to be anachronistic if you represent character depth. And so this was kind of a problem.
I was gonna say that, like, I was thinking about Romantic era literature when you were saying this, and that came like that's post 18th, or that's like around to post 18th century. Like, it's mainly 1800s or late 1700s. I remember reading back when I was in uni. I was taking a literature elective, that there's a lot of disagreement over where exactly the Romantic era of literature starts and ends, because I was thinking that there is a lot of richness of character in Romantic era novels. It's considered a response to Enlightenment era thinking, but this is the first time I've heard the idea that it might have been at least the idea of a richly internal character might have come about due to the prison system.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about this argument. This is generally thought of as kind of the transition from like picaresque to like the realist novel, right? So like, yes, like action, adventuring kind of heroic fiction, romantic fiction, not in the romantic era, but like as in sort of heroic romance derived from the sort of medieval conventions. I think that's a good point, that there have always been characters, but what the character of character is has shifts.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's a lot of people these days who just assume this is another Flintstonization again. There's a lot of people these days who just assume, as a matter of course, in art criticism or criticism of movies, books, and so on, that deeper characters are always necessarily a positive. And I've always kind of pushed back on this to say, like, well, I mean, books can focus on different things, right? And so it is interesting that like this almost kind of like obsession with deep characters and, you know, relatable characters and characters that you could almost believe are real is actually quite a modern standard or a modern invention as well. Because like I think that might have been why I was kind of more receptive to the Jack Shepherd story in your novel, is not because I, like you say, you were unhappy with Jack Shepherd's character in the novel. I kind of that didn't really make a difference to me while I was reading it, because I was paying more attention to what the themes of the Jack Shepherd story were. And so I was looking at things like, you know, the fact that the Sentinels were the precursor to, you know, a police force, the fact that Jack Shepherd was, you know, reimagined as a trans man, that Bess Khan was reimagined as a woman of a mixed race background, and I was going, this is all thematically very rich and I love it. But yeah, Dr. Voth is easily the best character in the novel regardless, and reading his section, I was almost more excited to read Dr. Voth sections than I was to read Jack Shepherd sections, even regardless. But that's because that, in addition to, you know, the character, he also tied back into the themes that were explored in the Jack Shepherd story as well. But yeah, he does kind of end up, his perspective at least ends up kind of almost taking over the novel. Because, and if any listeners haven't read the book, you know, we've already spoiled most of it, but you know, I'm about to give away what the twist near the end is. But yeah, so the novel is or the manuscript in the novel that Dr. Voth finds in his university library is a collective diary. So rather than being written from a single source, it was edited and rewritten, and bits were added and bits were subtracted over the years. When I was reading this, I was thinking that it was a stroke of genius, if I'm going to be honest, because I was like, yes, this is so good, I love it so much, because I'm the kind of nerd who enjoys like subversive literature that plays with the boundaries of fiction and narrative perspective and all that stuff. So I was just like on the edge of my seat when I was reading the part when it was revealed to be, you know, this fictional memoir. Can you tell me about like why you decided to do this, and sort of where this idea came from, and, you know, what your intent was with that?
Well, I mean, it comes from like a very romantic idea of just collectivities, and where historical change comes from, where subjectivity comes from, where aesthetics comes from, right? Just these collective sedimentations and collective generativeness, you know, nothing being singularly produced, whether it's, you know, these fictions of sort of like trans male self-making that again sort of were like kind of demanded by mainstream publications to constantly attest to, or, you know, the movement of history and collective actions like strikes and demonstrations. So, I mean, on a certain level, it was just a very romantic kind of thing around wanting to kind of make explicit the extent to which, you know, all cultural production on a certain level is the result of sort of collective forces. The other thing too, I think I felt a kind of frustration with some of the sort of like fetishizations of the archive, and again the sort of like the fantasy that you could, coming at me a little bit, and sometimes comes at sort of trans people from all directions, that you can kind of reach back into history and produce a kind of authoritative archival precursor, that you could just like reach into the archive and find this sort of historical, sort of singular truth and kind of progressive historical through line from the past to the present. And I think I felt frustrated with that, in the sense that I mean, there's a lot of things to say about archives. There's more than I could get to here. But one thing is that I think sometimes this sort of desire to make an archive a kind of simple place in which a clue to sort of subjectivity is found and a clue to history is found, kind of sidesteps these questions of sort of the social mediation of history, and aesthetics in general get kind of cut out. And again, around trans people, it's sort of assumed that there's just going to be a kind of like transparent historical precursor. I guess I wanted to just complicate the question of the archive a little bit and demonstrate the fact that the archive too is a kind of historical contingency. It's the product of what we understand language and discourse to be, what's considered to be an archival material and what isn't, is always kind of a question also around power and the institutionalization of language and of history. I liked the idea of having kind of the book, the sort of like the found document be this kind of like more fantastical archival source that was self-evidently a collective work, and always kind of itself kind of cast into question, but for that reason, if this makes sense, more true than the fantasy of just some kind of like archival, singular, preserved in amber object that just itself is the incarnation of history, which is, not how history works.
Is a way of understanding it to think that if you leave the retelling of history up to just like, individuals who are given the authority, who are given the privilege of being an authority on history, that you end up with this kind of like version of history that is not necessarily less true, but like it excludes certain perspectives and certain other types of information. Whereas if you embrace collective retelling of history, that it's geared more towards like what the majority of people in certain communities, or even that different communities will have different forms of historical retelling because their communities will decide what is important to them collectively. Whereas if you rely on, say, an individual authority, that there can be often a lot of bias that goes against certain communities. So, for example, like, trans people, LGBT people, we have our histories, but oftentimes what we're told is a very like cisgendered heterosexual version of history, and we're kind of excluded from the telling of history in that way.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a very like concrete and kind of point about this, but just that like, just an easy way of thinking about this is that so much of what is in an official archive is, for example, a forced confession. So prison confessions, right? They would have an individual who is called the Newgate Ordinary. I don't know why they're called an ordinary, but it's like some kind of jail functionary who would come and take basically people's so-called confessions before they were executed, and then they were essentially forced confessions that would then be sold at the execution, for profit, and then this goes in the historical record, and so you have to bring a fair amount of speculativeness to an archive like that, when it's really the product of such intense violence. And then, yes, around sort of the sort of medicalization of transgender subjectivity and the sort of forcing or the impelling of certain kinds of transgender confessions in order to have access to, say, hormones and something like this, suggests that you have to bring kind of a very critical historical eye to an archive. I felt much more interested in and comfortable with the idea of kind of representing, kind of like a fantasy document that's fictionalized, but this fictionalization is a labor of love done upon a potentially forced document. Because there were quite a number of these fake biographies of Shepard that were written, and there was even kind of like a hack autobiography that was, and some were said to be written by Daniel Defoe for profit, and I believe sold again at Shepard's execution. And I think I just had this fantasy, what if everyone who hated capitalism just came in and rewrote this thing?
That's amazing, actually. I love that idea. I kind of you mentioned very very early on in the beginning, but I kind of wanted to save this question for near the end. About the your fascination with Marxism and how it influenced the novel. And I'm kind of the opinion that you can kind of get an idea about the novel's like political positions just by listening to a lot of the premise described. But would you be able to go into more detail about the about how Marxism influenced the novel?
I mean, there's so many ways, and if I really described all of them, it would be really very boring. I think like the most kind of comprehensive answer to this has to do with the idea of histories told from below rather than from the perspective of people in power. And so, really, for me, like one of the kind of like the aha moment with reading around about Jack Shepherd had to do with reading a really, really great historian, the historian Peter Linebaugh, and he's a contemporary writer, and he has a great book called The London Hanged, and it's about 18th century legislation and how the intense explosion of legislation that you get when you get the birth of commerce and commercial capitalism just to protect private property. And he has a chapter on Shepherd and on Shepherd's execution. And that chapter goes against a truism of a lot of bourgeois 18th century historians who write about the scenes of executions. It's such a truism that it became unremarked in 18th century studies, where they would often describe the scenes of these executions as like almost sadistic, where the assumption was that people gathered to see ordinary people be executed because they really liked to see it. And Linebaugh just kind of interrupts this history to describe the ways in which these execution theaters were actually mass demonstrations against executions, and kind of goes into the idea of schemes people would come up with. Could you rescue a body back after it was executed and get it to a surgeon and revive your comrade? Right. I mean, that does take place in the book, and that's taken from Linebaugh, I think, when I kind of fictionalized that people went there to jeer at the executioners, that they went there to kind of howl in protest. And there's so much of sort of like so much of the book is about the minutiae, I think, of the birth of British commerce and the birth of Britain as a trading empire. But really, the heart of it is in this idea of protest, which to me is a kind of comes from this Marxist historiography around conceptualizing history from below. There also is like a formal aspect that I did mention, this kind of longstanding thing about the Frankfurt School theory. And I think I've been very affected by the extent to which, if you go back and read these theorists, if you read Adorno or Ernst Bloch or Benjamin, they're writing in these very poetic ways, social and cultural analysis. There's an extent to which actually a contemporary theorist, a woman named Susan Buck-Morse, she describes them in a way that really stuck with me, the Frankfurt School. And she says, they took the overcoming of the alienation of subject and object so seriously to heart, right? So under capitalism, we're kind of alienated from each other. We're alienated from the sort of products of our labor. And this utopian Frankfurt School view is about overcoming that alienation. And she says, the Frankfurt School took the overcoming of alienation so seriously that they despised the impartial, composed tone of academicians, which perpetuate a cold disconnectedness with the object. Just meaning that academic language is itself a kind of reiteration of, at times, of our alienation from the world. And I think there was, to me, kind of a Marxist Frankfurt Schoolian orientation toward history, where I had a desire to write in a less alienated way. I mean, this is very romantic, I guess, but where poetic language and aesthetic figuration is a kind of attempt to overcome the alienation of the subject and the object of study, the subject from their object of study, right? We're not separate from the objects of our study, and we're not separate from history. And can we manifest that lack of separation in the language that we use to write about history? And for me, in this instance, it meant writing history as a novel rather than in an academic way.
Well, it makes absolute sense to me, because when I was studying journalism in university, I was taught about, needing to remove yourself from the story and from needing to write everything in an objective, like non-biased way. But quickly learned, mainly because I had an interest in science reporting initially, that it's kind of a complete bourgeois fantasy to be able to bring an objective eye to anything. And that's partially why I'm at a LGBT radio station as well, is because like I don't want to be writing in this objective way, especially if we're talking about subjects such as LGBT rights, or in the case with the current political climate that's going on, Black Lives Matter and police violence. You can't really write in an objective, unbiased way, because the reality is that one side in that conflict is wrong, and you have to be able to make that judgment and write based on that. Well, I always, at the end of interviews with authors, I always ask them for book recommendations. So like, yeah, just for myself and for the people listening, recommend us all some books.
Oh, gee. Okay, you got to give me a second to think about this. You didn't prepare me for this. There is a book that's really important to the novel. That's Texaco by Patrick Chamoiseau. Patrick Chamoiseau had another book come out in the past year, another translation of a book that he had previously published that was translated as the title Slave Old Man. And it's a very short novel, and it's just astonishing. It's become, first of all, the language is, it's so poetic and lush that it almost becomes science fiction. It's just incredibly, almost surreal. And it's just tracking someone who has escaped slavery, running from a giant, huge, almost supernaturally enormous, I think, Mastiff dog. And the whole novel is just this chase. And that's kind of an astonishing, just a really overwhelming read. This year, I finally read N.K. Jemison's the 5th season science fiction, the first installment of her Inheritance trilogy. And that's just jaw-droppingly amazing. And another book that I absolutely loved this year, it's just easier to think about what I read this year than in general, absolutely loved, is another science fiction book by trans author Isaac Fellman. It was published under his former name, Rachel, but Isaac Fellman's book, it's called The Breath of the Sun. It actually won a Lambda Literary Award last year for science fiction, and it just tracks these kind of two ball outcast figures as they try to crest this like impossibly tall, almost perhaps an infinitely tall mountain. And it's amazing. So I guess it seems I really love a quest narrative. Oh, an old favorite, another quest narrative is China Miéville's The Scar. Have you read Have you read that one? That's the second book in his
No, I have not read that one.
Boss Log series. Well, maybe you're not a science fiction fanatic like myself.
I am not a science fiction person.
Okay.
I have attempted to get into science fiction several times and completely bounced off it. I bounced off Dune, I bounced off Foundation. I don't think I'm a science fiction person.
Okay, well, anyway, so none of my suggestions will be helpful to you then, but maybe someone else there.
It's okay. I've got some sci-fi readers in my audience. I know that.
Um,
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Yeah.
yeah, thank you.